Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
We've gathered a panel of expert analysts and practitioners to look more broadly at the prospects for the millennial generation. Do they agree with the findings of a new report published by the RSA today, which has got quite a lot of coverage, that argues that it's the uniquely strong entrepreneurial spirit of the millennials that can help us emerge from economic crisis?
I suppose the first thing to say really is that it's relatively obvious that we live in pretty pessimistic times at the moment. We hear endlessly about the afflictions of high unemployment, high debt, poor access to housing, which clearly does affect younger people even more than the wider population. But I was very struck by something Richard Florida said. He said that often the periods of the greatest economic gloom are also the periods of the greatest economic and business innovation. And the core of that change, that transformation of business, that high level of innovation, it's pretty obvious where it's coming from. It's coming from the internet, from the interactive web. Now, the important thing about these periods of innovation is they do ultimately create periods of higher growth. They do create periods of improvements in living standards. It does take time. It can take a number of years for that more booming economy to arise out of that greater innovation. But ultimately, I think it will be that entrepreneurial spirit that will drive growth and improved living standards, particularly for younger people, rather than anything that government or central banks can do. Enterprise is sort of being democratized by the web. It's not just consumers who are seizing control. It's also entrepreneurs who are finding that because of the web, they can set up businesses far more easily and at far lower cost than used to be the case. But the really interesting fact is that I think that transformation is being led by the younger generation themselves. Survey after survey shows that people in the 20 to 29 age bracket, the one thing they tend to share in common is that they are much more experimental with technology. They pride themselves far more in engaging with technology, and they are genuinely much more networked through the internet than older generations. So they are the ones who will seize this entrepreneurial moment, I think, far more than others. And I'd end with something which is completely impressionistic and anecdotal, so you can reject it at will if you wish. But I was taken down to Shoreditch House, which is, for those who haven't been there, is a sort of club in the heart of Tech City. It doesn't feel like a place that's full of pessimism and economic gloom. It feels like an ambitious, optimistic place. Now, people will say, oh, yeah, that's very elitist, it's London, it's a certain type of techie clique that are there. But what we see is that over the years, that ethos, that spirit, that extra confidence that a particular entrepreneurial elite generates does ultimately spread out to the wider population.
Thank you, Adam.
We did a survey in 1998, nearly 15 years ago, with Mori, Opinion Research, and we looked at the attitudes of the millennial generation, we call them, the people who would become of age at the turn of the millennium. In other words, we were looking at teenagers, late teenagers. And we found to our surprise the highest single career aspiration then, at 48%, was to start and run their own business. And it was a surprise because completely unanticipated. Now, we did a follow-up poll last month with YouGov this time. And yes, it has changed marginally. It's now 49%. This is, again, teenagers. It's not people in their early 20s. Given that small businesses are responsible for creating 2/3 of all of the new jobs in Britain, clearly it matters how many are started. And we look at the big hurdles. We ask people, what are the hurdles, the difficulties that they pick out? For example, you couldn't have started either Apple or Microsoft in Britain because they wouldn't have been allowed to operate a business from a garage, which is where both of those two started out. Just a minor point, but it is a hurdle. Business premises are so closely regulated in Britain compared with, say, the United States. And then there is the regulation, the cost of compliance with regulation. And the big jump here is when you move from a one-person business to take on the first employee. And that's a really big jump because then you're into filling in forms for PAYE, income tax, for national insurance contributions, and then you get into employee entitlements, maternity leave, paternity leave, protection of employment, holiday pay, sick pay. All of that lot is loaded on you with that first step. So that's the big one, moving from a one-person business to 1 + 1 or 2 + 3, adding the extra jobs to it. And then there's, of course, taxation. That was mentioned because people need to plough back everything they're earning into investment to expand the business. So tonight I come along with 2 concrete proposals which I think would assist. Both of them involve treating small and new firms in a separate category from the rest of the economy. First of all, obviously, we should relax the planning laws. We should make some rule that it doesn't really matter what you do in the first 5 years. After that, we'll start looking at your premises. Secondly, and this is a crucial one, small businesses should be able to treat all of their employees as self-employed, which means you don't have to fill in a PAYE, NIC, maternity leave, all of that stuff that I listed earlier doesn't apply, because self-employed people have none of those. Now, you might say, some do, but these employees would then get none of those entitlements, to which I say, well, at the moment they're unemployed and don't have them anyway. At least they'd have a job with this one. And the third one is a straight copy from what they did in Germany, where Schroeder introduced the rule that if you are employed part-time and earn 400 euros a month or less, it's not taxable. You don't get any rights. You can be dismissed instantly. But you are allowed to take as many of those part-time jobs as you want. Only one with each employer, mind you. And they created 500,000 new jobs in the first year that they introduced that. And youth unemployment was halved in the first year. So clearly, I toss out those 2 principal innovations to say basically, they would make a difference. Can it be done? Hey, you've got to change the mindset of the Treasury. Can that be done? There's a guy in ancient classical literature who hauled a stone uphill. It's like that. But hey, we're optimists on this side. This is the growth agenda. Set young talent free, and it'll achieve more than it's ever done before.
So I was absolutely delighted to see that young people are feeling more entrepreneurial. The advent of social media and the incredible falling cost of technology has just made it easier and easier to set up businesses. Discover them nearly every day, and one of my favourite things is playing around on the internet, finding out about particularly what young people have come up with. There's an extraordinary young man called Jamal Edwards who runs something called SB.TV online. And he is a young man from Brixton who has got something now like, somebody in the audience is nodding, correct me if I'm wrong, but maybe 500,000 Twitter followers and a TV channel that broadcasts on YouTube with millions of followers. And he's become an absolute sensation. And he talks about music and he talks about politics and he talks about whatever he quite fancies. And he has got a real ability to engage and inspire his audience. And he just did that with his own video camera from his bedroom, and it just caught on and people watched him. And now he's got massive sponsorship deals and he's an empire. But I've also met many young people who think about social enterprise or not-for-profits or starting something themselves that are in a more active political sense, who would definitely determine themselves as entrepreneurs but are focusing on social change as opposed to just commercial gain. And I think that is an optimistic thought as growth in its traditional sense for the economy. Just going to give you one example. There's a fabulous young woman called Lily Laupenan. She started a business called Apps for Good, and she encourages programmers to make small apps for charities. And she's starting to think about how to solve social problems using clever small apps and technology. And I just cite her as an example of a young person that I've got extreme respect for. But, and this is where I sound a very, very severe note of caution. When I look at the education system, I do not see an education system that is either encouraging children to think about taking more risks or become entrepreneurs, or one that is equipping them with technical skills. And this, for me, is unbelievably severe for the country. And this isn't something that's happened in the last 2 years or the last 5 years. It's been happening, I would argue, systemically for a long period of time. In Estonia, all first graders learn how to code. Imagine if we put that at the top of the agenda here in the UK. I really believe that's what would fuel growth, not in the short term, clearly, but in the medium to long term. In the US, I guess, well documented, but there is a much more entrepreneurial spirit in the education system, as I understand it, and many more opportunities for children to go and learn about businesses or businesses to come into schools to do programs. But also, we still have a huge number of families with no access to technology at all, which is something that I've been working on over the last few years. 500,000 families we know have no internet access at home and also come from the most vulnerable areas of the country. So I am optimistic. I think that the merging of technologies and the lowering of barriers to entry will continue. I think that the mishmashing of sectors together is hugely exciting for entrepreneurs in social enterprises as well as in commercial enterprises, but I don't think it will happen, and I don't think it will continue to grow unless we embed it in the education system and we fight for the most vulnerable and disadvantaged people's opportunities as well.
Just think, a couple of 100 years ago, there was really only one way to earn a living, or for lots of people to earn a living from their bedroom. And now there are many, many more. And if for no other reason, technological innovation is a wonderful thing. There was a very, very persuasive report published by the FT in March, which pointed out that this generation, the millennials, are the first to have living standards lower than a generation born 10 years before them. And that's extraordinary, actually. It's an indictment of our society in lots of ways. Indeed, as I was flicking through this report, Adam writes at one point about one of the great things that happens in the 1950s is the explosion of white goods, whereby suddenly millions of households can afford to buy, things like washing machines. And it struck me that actually one of the most palpable problems that young people face is that they don't own washing machines because they haven't formed households. Instead, they have use of washing machines, but they're either owned by their parents, a third of them live at home, or by their landlords. And as well as the problems that are associated with housing, they also face a very uncertain future because of the huge quantities of debt and unfunded liabilities, which Britain and America and many other Western countries have racked up over the last few decades, and which we're not in a particularly good position to pay without impacting on future consumption by the millennial generation as they get older and the generations that follow them. And of course, right now, they're very often unemployed. 40% of all those people unemployed in Britain are under 30. And that strikes me as a very striking figure. Of course, they're likely to be more entrepreneurial. They're damn sure likely to be more self-employed, because that's the only way they can actually find work. And so, whilst I am cautiously enthusiastic about being optimistic about their entrepreneurial kind of opportunities and talents and proclivities, I also just must caution against us welcoming a society in which the next generation are increasingly unstable. They can't form households. They find it more difficult to have children. Their consumption habits are massively undermined because of huge public debts that they have to pay. And they will be free, but they won't be happy and be able to live good lives. And that I think, is extremely worrying and should remain the focus of our attention on them. Thank you.
You made the point very elegantly about the fact that I think you said Apple or Microsoft wouldn't have started here because they were built in a garage. I remember someone saying to me once that if Bill Gates been British, he'd have ended up the most successful software engineer in Basingstoke. And the point there was that, there also seems to be an issue about the entrepreneurial spirit in amongst British business, in the sense that people grow businesses to a certain size, and then, tell me if this is wrong, the conventional wisdom is they go to a certain size and then they sell it off and go and play golf for the rest of their lives. There's a kind of lack of ambition.
There's nothing wrong with selling a business. We teach people 3 rules. Our ASI, when we have schools in, 1, you don't make money working for someone else. 2, you don't make money starting and running your own business, because you'll work night and day, you'll put in more hours than you've ever dreamed of, you'll plough everything back into it. You make money selling your own business, is what we tell them. And there's nothing wrong with that. You build up a successful business, then a big company looks at it and says, yeah, we'll have that, because we can incorporate that. It's added value to the system. We could use that added value to enhance our own product. Nothing wrong with it. Don't go off and play golf. Start another one.
Thank you. Martha, I wonder whether the people you've cited are making much money. And the point I'm making there is that have we yet solved this problem of how you actually make money on the internet? I mean, what we saw with music, of course, is that bands have gone from doing tours to sell albums to doing albums to sell tours, and that's a new business model. But there still is quite a big issue about whether or not all this entrepreneurship on the web is going to, in the end, there is really a kind of business model underlying most of it.
I would dispute the most of it. I think you're right that there are still challenges, particularly when moving traditional industries to those are being smashed apart by online industries, and sometimes that happens, moving from paid to free and all the things that people will know well. But there are absolutely examples of extraordinarily profitable new businesses, and businesses that have an entirely different cost base that allow themselves to be leveraged in a completely new way, and social media is a great example of that. And the last numbers that I saw are that the internet economy contributes about 10% now of our GDP, and I know that's taking the percentage of traditional businesses that are done online, so it's a slight mishmash of numbers, but it still does show there is a huge amount of value to be had through selling things online.
There's a kind of dog that isn't yet barking, and I kind of think is going to bark, and that is about young people in higher education. So on the internet now, you can see the best lecturers in the world doing the best lectures in the world, and increasingly it looks as though it's going to be possible, I think it was MIT, wasn't it, that said you can start now to do your exams externally. Do you think, thinking about young people and debts and young people's creativity, do you think young people are going to carry on building up massive debts to go and do something which they can do in their bedrooms?
Gosh, that's an interesting question. Before I answer,
because if they're entrepreneurial, they're not, maybe 3 years, just meandering around a university building up debts is not the kind of thing they'd want to do.
I suppose the simple question is, will it be possible to have very cheap education that way, or will a lot of the big players whose qualifications are the most sought after and desired maintain their market position and charge huge amounts of money for it? It would strike me as very peculiar if they didn't, in which case, if it is very, very expensive, there's a question about whether the government will successfully fund it or not. Clearly it should get cheaper. Clearly education should be cheaper. Clearly we should do all that we possibly can to educate the next generation. Because as your old boss Tony Blair laid down in 2005 in that very convincing conference speech, in an era of globalization and innovation, you really have no protection but the skills you can bring to the table and a certain amount of hard work and tenacity. So it seems to me very important that if we can't control how tenacious people are, we at least ensure they've got the best possible opportunity to be educated.